I'm going to just say a few words by way of introduction of Rupert. Most of you don't need an introduction to his work. When we had Rupert speak, it might have been 2 to 3 years ago, at a public program, I said a few words by way of placing Rupert's work in context, in a larger context than just what one might read if you read the Wikipedia article on Rupert, or on any of us for that matter. Okay. Just 1, 2, 3. Okay. So I'll just read these few notes by way of introduction. For about a half an hour, kind of focusing in on the book, his most recent book, Science Set Free, also known as The Science Delusion, as it was published in the UK, and perhaps Rupert might say a word about the choice of titles, why one in the UK and one in the US, and then we'll open to dialogue, and at that point we can move a little bit more into the into a circular seating. Our speaker tonight, Rupert Sheldrake, this is tonight, back then, this afternoon, is one of the most clear-thinking, revolutionary, influential, and splendidly controversial scientists of our time. He's a Socrates among the Athenians, upsetting their dogmatic, unconscious assumptions. He arouses their ire precisely because they uncomfortably sense that he is seeing something that they haven't, which destabilizes not only their certainties, but their entire underlying frame of reference. He suggests that their fixed earth might be moving, that their unchanging laws of nature might be ever-evolving habits. Over and over again, in many areas of research, he suggests that there might indeed be more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in their materialist philosophy. He points out that the mechanistic perspective that continues to underlie the mainstream scientific worldview is secretly anthropomorphic, for there are, in fact, no machines in a state of nature. All machines are human-made, just as is the metaphor imposed on nature by the mechanistic theory, the mechanomorphic view of the universe. Rupert has now published over 80 scientific papers in peer-reviewed journals such as Nature, and 10 remarkable books, starting with A New Science of Life, 33 years ago, I think.
Yes.
Something like that, 33, 34 years ago. Then going through The Presence of the Past, The Rebirth of Nature, 7 Experiments That Could Change the World, and now Science Set Free. I'm just naming headline titles. He was a fellow of Clare College and Cambridge University, and a research fellow of the Royal Society, and a member of many scientific societies like the Society for Experimental Biology and the Cambridge Philosophical Society. Many consider his theory of morphogenetic fields to be one of the most fruitful hypotheses for biology since the origin of species, and it is also proving to be very fruitful for psychology as well. James Hillman has proposed that what he calls the acorn theory for better understanding the narrative arc of individual human lives, our biographies. Just as the acorn holds implicit within itself the pattern for the growth and maturation of the oak tree and draws toward it what it needs to actualize that potential and to actualize its oak tree-ness to its full realization. So also, Hillman believes, is each individual psyche shaped by a unique individual energy, a daimon, a calling, expressed in different ways throughout the lifetime, drawing towards it those childhood experiences necessary for what is to come, like the trumpet that just happens to be given to the young New Orleans street waif, Louis Armstrong, and where you draw towards you positive as well as very challenging experiences that are necessary to that destiny. And this process is ever more clearly evident as the person follows that calling and life's work, and ever more fully actualizes what is in potentia in the acorn. I think we can see this process working in Rupert's life from the start, as he surrounded himself when very young with a host of animals, from caterpillars and tortoises to pigeons and a dog. His father was an herbalist and microscopist who taught him botany and showed him the wonders of nature through his microscope. While still young, he collected plants and read books on natural history. He wanted to become a biologist while he was still only 12, and then he went on to study the sciences at Cambridge and the philosophy and history of science at Harvard. Our two universities, I think he was there at the same time John Cleese here was there at Cambridge, the exact same years, and then you were at Harvard in the 60s.
63 to 4.
63 to 4. And the two Cambridges. And may I say just one more thing to place this presentation or this dialogue in context. I think there's no more crucial task today for thoughtful individuals in our precarious civilization than to reach towards and then disseminate a larger and deeper perspective, to see our world and our place in it with new eyes, and thus to transform our culture's worldview. In the course of the great modern development, a tremendous shift took place in our civilization from a worldview in which religion and theology had the center of gravity as the principal power defining our cultural vision and our civilizational strategies. And it moved from that to one in which science, by and large, holds that position. I say by and large. There's complexities there. Obviously, the corporate world has a lot to say about what it does with that scientific knowledge. But the disenchanted worldview of the mainstream contemporary scientific perspective creates the cosmic context and the Gaian context, or the context within the biological and geological sciences, within which a certain attitude about objectifying nature has prominence. But modern science and the specific kind of rationality and sets of assumptions that accompanied it became a new faith, a faith in modern reason that could shine its light on the world and, like the sun, brilliantly illuminate all, objectifying the cosmos and the earth and empowering the human subject, all in one move. But with this extraordinary confidence came a shadow of hubris, of exaggerated assurance, of superior knowledge and certainty, a cutting off of sources of knowing that other cultures and other ages had developed and honored as necessary for any authentic engagement with reality. Our world today, so fraught with the consequences of modern civilization's reductionist assumptions, deeply needs what Rupert Sheldrake has brought to the table of scientific discussion. The precision of his thought and articulation, the breadth of his expertise and erudition, the calm equilibrium with which he engages what has surprisingly often been fierce hostility, all these represent a model of intellectual excellence and courage for all of us. Rupert Sheldrake is perhaps as well suited as anyone living today, by training, by sensibility, and by courage in battle, to engage this task. He's a Lancelot in our round table as we seek to recover the sacred mystery of our cosmos. Let's welcome him warmly to San Francisco.
Well, thank you, Rick, for your very generous introduction. And thank you also for your support over so many years. I've known Rick for, I don't know, 25 years, maybe 30, starting at Esalen. And I've spent, over many years, been at CIIS as well. I'm a tremendous fan of this institute because there are very few places in the Western world where the big questions that are really important are actually discussed. I get emails from people almost every week saying, I want to look at the big picture of where we're going and what's going on, where can I study it? And I always give the same answer, CIIS, because there's hardly any competition in this area. It's astonishing that what's one of the most important areas to investigate is carried on in so few institutions, and this is the leading light in that world. So it's a pleasure and an honor to be here again. And Rick's asked me to talk a little bit about the central themes of my most recent book, Science Set Free, which is called The Science Delusion in Britain. Neither of those were my original title for the book, but when my British publisher wanted to publish it, he said that their offer of publishing it was conditional on changing the title to The Science Delusion. And I said, well, I don't really want to have a title that plays off Dawkins because it gives too much importance to his book. And it's also not really what this book's about. It's about the materialist worldview, which Dawkins is, and other materialist theses is based, and indeed, which is the foundation of the whole atheist or new atheist movements. I said, so it's not really a riposte to Dawkins, and I don't want it to be locked into that view. He said, well, we insist on this because sales and marketing say it will sell twice as many copies. And they were probably right. So I had to agree. But when it came to the title for the American book, this title just didn't work. Even when I tried it out with quite sophisticated American friends in San Francisco, and it doesn't get better than that, I found a surprising number of people who were puzzled by the idea of the science delusion. They said, are you a climate change denier? Is this against evolution? And I said, no, I'm not saying science is deluded. They said, well, why call it that? And I said, well, it plays off a book called The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins. They said, Richard who? Whereas in Britain, he's ranked as one of our all-time great public intellectuals and is constantly in the media and on the television. You can scarcely pass a week without having his comments on some subject or another. In America, his popularity seems mainly to be confined to the kind of intellectual atheist or agnostic class, rather than having a much greater popular following. So in America, my publishers thought that there should be a more positive title, since Americans are more positive in general. Also, they're in favor of liberty. So it was Deepak Chopra who actually came up with the idea, because he has a very good way of understanding and putting things clearly. Deepak suggested, why not call it Science Set Free? So I thought it was a really good idea. And it actually expresses what the book's about better than the British title. What the book is about the dogmas that I think are constricting the sciences and have done for more than 100 years. And what's happened in science is a kind of confusion or conflict between science as a method of inquiry based on hypothesis, investigation, empirical data, and so forth, ideally free from dogma, and the reality, which is that most of the sciences, all of them actually, have been captured by the ideology or metaphysics of materialism, philosophical materialism. By materialism, I'm not here referring to its common everyday usage about people who spend too much time in shopping malls. I'm referring to the philosophical doctrine that the ultimate reality is matter, and therefore consciousness is derivative from matter. and is nothing but the activity of the brain. It leads to an entirely cerebrocentric view of consciousness that heavens. I was about to comment on the inappropriateness of the machine metaphor. So this very limited view of consciousness is the biggest problem in materialism, and I'll come to that in a moment. But what I want to start by doing is just outlining the 10 dogmas which are taken for granted by virtually all scientists and virtually all educated people, because most university graduates, whether or not they've studied the natural sciences, are led to believe that these are the correct view of seeing nature. And even if you don't agree with them in private, at least you have to pretend to believe in them in public. Otherwise, you'll be thought to be stupid or uneducated or superstitious. I think the present situation in relation to materialism is a little bit like Russia under Brezhnev, where there was an official doctrine which not everyone believed in. How few people in Russia were actual committed communists? Very few really believed it, but in public, most pretended to. And when rousing communist speeches were given at party congresses, halls of thousands of delegates all dutifully clapped, and dissidents were very few in number and mostly confined to psychiatric institutions. They were put there. But hardly anyone, well, not hardly anyone, but most people didn't really believe it. And most people don't really believe in materialism. Most people don't really believe that they are nothing but automata, that their brain is nothing but a computer, and that they don't have any free will or genuine choice. Hardly anyone believes that. Even materialists don't believe it, because they'd like you to choose to believe in materialism on the basis of reason and evidence, rather than believe in it just because your brain makes you believe in it because of conditioning, chance, or brain chemistry. Anyway, the 10 dogmas, which are usually taken for granted, are very rarely challenged, and most people don't even realize they're dogmas or assumptions, are as follows. First, that nature is mechanical. The universe is a machine, animals and plants are machines, we are machines. In fact, everything's machinery. This came into vogue in the 17th century, and it was the founding metaphor of the modern sciences. And the reason it became the founding metaphor was that the founding fathers of modern science were breaking away from the older worldview taught in all the European universities and monasteries and schools, which was really a form of Christian animism. In the medieval universities, people were taught that the Earth is a living organism, Mother Earth, that the heavens are alive, the stars are intelligent, that they're populated by minds, angelic minds, that animals and plants have souls. The reason we call animals animals is because they have a soul, or anima, and that human souls included the plant level of soul, which shapes the form of the body, the animal level of the soul, which underlies the emotions, the instincts, and the senses, and gives us emotions which we share with animals, like fear, lust, anger, etc. And the human soul contained a third element, the intellectual or conscious soul, which was to do with reason and was open to the Spirit of God. So the rational mind, which was embedded in a much larger psychic system, which was largely unconscious. The whole of this worldview was animate. The living God was the God of a living world, and the living world was organic and purposeful. Nature had internal purposes. Now, the machine view of nature displaced that, and precisely by getting rid of the souls from nature. And souls were drained out of nature until all that was left was purposeless machinery. Now, of course, machines do have purposes, but they're not inherent to the machines. A car has a purpose. It wouldn't be made otherwise. It's to get you from one place to another. But the car itself has no purpose. Its purpose is external to the car. It's in the minds of its owners or users. the difference with an organism is that organisms have their own goals or purposes. I learned this to my cost when I was I went to a trip in Ireland. In fact, I went to a transpersonal conference in the west of Ireland. And after it, we were offered, as part of the program, a horse ride around some beautiful Irish mountains. And I'd never ridden before, so I was given this horse, and they told me it was a very reliable animal. I sat on it. It seemed to know just what it was doing, and I hoped it would go off with the other horses around these beautiful mountains. But instead, it branched off at a particular junction and confidently walked down the road until it ended up at its stables. And it had a definite idea as to where it wanted to go, whereas if I got in a car, that wouldn't have happened. So the organisms have purposes, machines don't. And so the idea was to drain all the purposes out of nature. And in the 17th century, the founders of modern science were devout Christians, and they thought that by downgrading nature, they could upgrade God. They thought it was pious to take this view, because all the purposes of nature were taken out of nature and put in the mind of God. God was the purpose of the whole universe. Before, the animals and plants had all had their own purposes, delegated purposes, ultimately derived from the divine purpose, but inherent in the organisms. This took the purposes out. And it led to a dualistic view of nature, sometimes called Cartesian dualism, which created a duality of a machine universe made of unconscious matter. On the other hand, a world of consciousness or spirit, which consists of God, angels, and human rational minds. And the spirit world was immaterial, outside time and space. The natural world was material, unconscious, and inside time and space. And this created a duality between mind and body, between humans and animals, because we had rational souls, animals didn't. They were just machines. So it was okay to vivisect them. They couldn't feel pain. They couldn't think. And it's okay to grow them in factory farms. The whole factory farming and agribusiness model is based on this mechanistic way of thinking. And third, it created a division between science and religion. Religion got God, angels, and the human spirit, and science got nature. Previously, the spirit pervaded all of nature, and there was no such division. So the first step is the machine metaphor. Nature's mechanical. Most people don't even realize it's just a metaphor or an assumption. They think it's a fact. The second assumption of the 10 dogmas is that matter is unconscious. I've already mentioned that. Descartes defined matter as unconscious and moved the whole of consciousness into this separate category of spirit, God, angels, and human minds. The third assumption is that nature is purposeless. And that follows from the machine as a metaphor. It's not been proved scientifically. It's not been proved to many places of decimals by experiment. It's simply an assumption. If nature is a machine, it has no inherent purpose. So animals have no inherent purpose. Plants have no inherent purpose. We ought to have no inherent purpose, but we seem to. That's a problem. And the whole universe and evolution has no inherent purpose. It's just blind chance. Again, this is an assumption based on a metaphor. So the fourth assumption is that the laws of nature are fixed. All the laws of nature, and indeed the constants, were fixed at the moment of the Big Bang and have been the same ever since. In the 17th century, they thought that the laws of nature were ideas in the mind of God, and therefore transcended nature and had the properties of God, universal, omnipotent, and so on. The so-called laws of nature are still believed by most physicists to have those properties. They're believed to be universal, changeless, and so on. In the 17th century, it made sense in terms of a political metaphor. God was like the cosmic emperor, and he was also the cosmic law enforcement agency, so nothing could disobey these laws. So the idea of eternal laws of nature was built into the foundations of science in the 17th century. When the Big Bang theory came in 1966, giving us a vision of a radically evolutionary universe, this, of course, left the eternal laws of nature free-floating with the assumption they must all be there at the very beginning. That was the old assumption of science. The pre-evolutionary view of cosmology was carried over into evolutionary cosmology with this assumption they must all still be fixed, even though the universe evolves. The next assumption is that the total amount of matter and energy is always the same, except at the moment of the Big Bang, when it all suddenly appeared from nowhere. As my friend Terence McKenna used to say, modern science is based on the principle, give us one free miracle and we'll explain the rest. And the one free miracle is the appearance of all the laws of nature and all the matter and energy in the universe from nothing in a single instant. And the assumption that the laws of nature are fixed has led modern cosmologists into an extraordinary set of intellectual contortions. If the laws of nature that govern you and me and grass and birds and everything else were all fixed at the moment of the Big Bang in exactly the right way for life to emerge and us to exist, out of all the possible laws and constants that they could have been, why are they just right for us to be here? This is called the cosmological anthropic principle. Why are they right for us? And the usual debate that goes on within modern science, cosmology, and philosophy says there are only two alternatives. First, they must have been fixed in exactly the right way by a kind of deistic God outside nature, an engineering God who fine-tunes the laws and constants to make them exactly right for us, an intelligent designer. Or, for those who don't like the intelligent designer model, and I don't either, I believe in God, but I don't believe that God's an intelligent designing engineer outside the cosmos. The alternative view is that there are billions, quadrillions of actual universes, of which this is only one, and this is the only one fit for us to live in, so it's the only one we can know about, but all the others actually exist. So it's just a matter of chance that we're in the right one. All the others actually exist. I had an argument with the Astronomer Royal in Britain, Lord Rees, who was President of the Royal Society and Master of Trinity College, Cambridge. I mean, he's risen to the highest position you could possibly achieve in the world, in the pecking order of science. And he happens to be an old friend. His wife's the godmother of one of our children. So we were having breakfast one morning. And I said to him, Martin, I can't understand why you want to proliferate universes so endlessly. I mean, trillions, quadrillions of universes. I said, it just seems to me such an extravagant hypothesis. And he said, yes, but this way we can get rid of God. And I said, but surely, isn't this proliferating universes, isn't this the ultimate violation of Occam's razor, the principle that entities should not be multiplied unnecessarily? I agree it's a bit of a problem. We're working on it. But they haven't even got rid of God, because as theologians and philosophers have pointed out, an infinite God would be the God of an infinite number of universes. So all they've done is proliferated universes. There's not a shred of evidence for any of these billions or quadrillions of extra universes. And yet, the majority of cosmologists, at least in Britain, prefer that hypothesis to what they see as the alternative, the intelligent design hypothesis. But both of these ways of thinking, the universal, the multiverse theories, are necessary if we drop the idea the laws of nature were fixed at the beginning, if they're more like habits, something I've been saying for years, and an idea that was proposed first by C.S. Peirce, an American philosopher at the beginning of the 20th century, an idea now taken up by the cosmologist Lee Smolin in his recent book on time. If the laws of nature evolve like habits, they don't all have to be fixed exactly right at the beginning. They don't need an intelligent designer. There can be a creativity inherent in nature, and the laws can stabilize as habits. They're not laws, they're habits. And in fact, the very concept of laws of nature is deeply anthropocentric, like so much of modern science, which claims to have gone beyond these crude, infantile ways of thinking. It's anthropocentric because only humans have laws, and what's more, only civilized humans have laws. Tribes have customs, which are more like habits. And so to say that there are laws of nature is intensely anthropocentric. As C.S. Lewis once said, to say that a stone falls to earth because it's following a law makes it a man and even a citizen. So I think we can simply drop the idea of fixed laws of nature. So anyway, most scientists aren't even aware there's an alternative, that the laws of nature are fixed. It's simply taken for granted. And so it is by most people who've gone to university, because all these assumptions are implicitly built in to the modern worldview. The next assumption is that biological heredity is material. Everything you inherit biologically is inherited materially in DNA, the genes, or more recently in chemical modifications of the genes, epigenetics. But either way, it's chemically inherited, materially inherited. Now, there are many problems with that view, and in fact, the genetic theory of heredity and the neo-Darwinian theory of evolution are coming unraveled at the moment. I may have time to talk about that later, because this is one of the most exciting and interesting developments in the last few years in biology. The whole of the standard evolutionary theory, selfish gene theory, is in disarray. There are hardly any sophisticated evolutionary theorists who any longer believe in old-style neo-Darwinism, because it's simply been superseded. And no one quite knows what to do with these new problems that have arisen. Anyway, I'll leave that aside for the moment. The next assumption is that memories are stored inside the brain. Most people who challenge some of the assumptions of science accept, almost everyone seems to accept, that memories are stored inside the brain. Usually on the grounds of, well, where else could they be? But this is a materialist assumption, because if the mind is the brain, then memories, part of the mind or mental activity, have to be in the brain. And for 100 years, people have tried to find these supposed memory traces in brains in modified phosphorylated proteins, in modified synapses or nerve endings, etc. Over and over again, they've drawn a blank in this quest for the memory traces. But it hasn't put anyone off searching for them. Instead of saying, well, wait a minute, maybe they're not there, the assumption is they must be there. Just give us a few billion more dollars and 10, 20 more years and we'll figure it out. This is an example of promissory materialism. Whenever they don't know the answer, they say, well, we don't know it yet, but we will know it at some undated time in the future. Undated promissory notes against future explanations. So that's an assumption. And later today, I may talk about my own hypothesis of morphic resonance. But according to that hypothesis, the brain doesn't store memories. It's like a receiver that tunes into them. They're broadcast across time, as it were, from the past. And the brain picks up memories, just as a TV set picks up invisible transmissions. It's a receiver rather than a storage device. Our brains are more like TV receivers than video recorders. And the evidence fits much better with the idea that the brains are not storing memories than it does with the idea that they are in the brain. But again, this is not something that's on the cards within the realm of neuroscience because it's simply too taboo. It goes against this assumption. So billions and billions of dollars, hundreds of billions, have been spent on memory research, all on that assumption. Not one penny, as far as I know, has been spent on looking at alternatives to that, because it's so universally assumed that must be true. The next assumption is that the mind is nothing but the brain. I mentioned this earlier. Mental activity is brain activity. This is a consequence of the materialist hypothesis. And the ninth assumption, it follows from the previous one, which is that psychic phenomena like telepathy are illusory. They must be illusory if the mind's nothing but the brain, because thoughts in your mind couldn't possibly have effects at a distance, or contact events in the future, or be influenced by the mind's own future. The general assumption here is that although most people claim to have had telepathic experiences or other psychic experiences, they're simply deluded about their own experience. And when parapsychologists come up with evidence that suggests these things are real, then the people who've come up with the evidence are either fools or frauds. And this evidence is all flawed. And there are entire skeptic organizations designed to counteract any evidence for psychic phenomena. They're very powerful, they're very well organized. The American Committee for Skeptical Inquiry publishes the Skeptical Inquirer magazine, has a circulation of about 60 or 70,000. Michael Shermer's Skeptic magazine has about 50,000. There's over 100,000 card-carrying skeptics in the United States. And the number of full-time parapsychology researchers is about 3. So they're outnumbered 33,000 to 1 by a far better funded organization, these skeptic organizations. Now, the people in these organizations usually know nothing whatever about psychic phenomena. They simply know it must be wrong. I had an argument a couple of years ago with Daniel Dennett, who's a fellow, a materialist philosopher and a fellow of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. And I said to him, Dan, do you think that parapsychology is a pseudoscience? He said, of course it is. He said, because it's investigating phenomena that don't exist. And I said, would you be prepared to defend that position in a public debate? He said, no. And I said, well, why not? He said, well, I haven't had time to look at the evidence. So I said, well, how can you be so sure it's a pseudoscience then? He said, it has to be. He said, because it goes against everything we know about the mind and about nature and the whole of established science. You know, what's more likely to be wrong, the whole of institutional science or a few people weird psychics who think they're having experiences that they can't really properly explain. This is, you know, one of the most sophisticated and highly esteemed philosophers in the United States, a leading philosopher of mind. I've had many debates with skeptics, and very few of them rise above that level. If you're interested in seeing a fuller documentation of what the skeptics are up to and where they're coming from, check out a recently developed website called skepticalaboutskeptics.org, which has a who's who of media skeptics and a portrait of the various skeptical organizations. And the final, last of the 10 assumptions is that mechanistic medicine is the only kind that really works. Alternative and complementary therapies may appear to work, but that's just because people would have got better anyway, or it's nothing but the placebo effect. Now, of course, the placebo effect, which shows the power of mind over healing, is itself an unexplained phenomenon, but nevertheless, it's used to explain away alternative and complementary medicine. And again, this is not just some theoretical assumption believed by a few academics in ivory towers. This is the basis of the entire funding system for medical research and medical training and teaching. In recent years, there have been some improvements, particularly in the United States. The National Institutes of Health have a research budget of $32 billion a year for mechanistic medical research. And they now have a Center for Complementary and Alternative Medicine with a budget of $100 million a year. But it's a tiny percentage of the entire budget. But at least there's something. In Britain, we have nothing. The entire Medical Research Council spends hundreds of millions of pounds of public money every year on medical research and not one penny on complementary or alternative medical research, despite the fact that most people in Britain have been to therapists of that kind, one kind of therapist or another. I once asked the Minister of Science in the Labour government, Lord Sainsbury, about his views on this. I suggested that some of the medical research budget should go to look at these phenomena. And he said, what's the point? And I said, because many people are interested in them. And he said, well, it's because they don't understand science. He's not a scientist himself. I don't think he understands very much. But he said, these people are just quacks, so it'd be a waste of money. And that was the end of the discussion. So this affects medical insurance, the National Health Service, medical policies, etc. Of course, these alternative therapies all exist, but most of them are not properly researched or not properly funded through standard National Health Services or insurance policies. So these assumptions, these 10 assumptions, shape the pre-installed worldview of the average university graduate. Most people emerge from university with these views, at least implicitly, as part of their mindset. And they often defend them because they want to be seen as smart, educated, and modern. But I think every single one of these views is false. And every single one of them, I think, is holding back science and preventing free inquiry into areas where, by breaking out of them, we could make much more interesting discoveries than we're making now. And it's not as if science, as presently constituted, is working very well. It's obeying the law of diminishing returns. And in think tanks in London and Washington, D.C., there's a lot of discussion at the moment about what policymakers call the innovation deficit. The innovation deficit is based on the analysis that, first, on the assumption that the West can't compete with China or Asia in general in mass manufacturing of goods or in mass provision of services, because so many of them are outsourced to India or the Philippines or other countries. The West is supposed to be able to compete through innovation, being the leading edge of innovation. But then if you look at where are the innovations, where are the breakthroughs of the last 20 years, breakthroughs of the magnitude of the ones that gave us computers, jet engines, penicillin, the internet, etc., mobile phones, those were all based on breakthroughs in the 20th century. Where are the breakthroughs of the 21st century? We're always reading in newspapers, breakthrough in cancer research, new gene identified that could help cure cancer, all that kind of thing. But real breakthroughs, real innovations, are very, very few and far between. A good place to look at a history of this is a book by Dr. James Lefanu, Lefanu, called The Rise and Fall of Modern Medicine. He's a British doctor who writes a medical column in one of our newspapers, the Daily Telegraph. And what he shows is that the triumphs of modern medicine, the great breakthroughs that transformed medicine, things like vaccination, inoculation, antibiotics, heart transplants, organ transplants, keyhole surgery, etc., almost all of them took place before 1990. The last great breakthrough, and perhaps one of the least significant, but a serious breakthrough, was the discovery that peptic ulcers are caused by bacteria rather than stress, and they can often be cured by antibiotics. He ranks that as one of the last of the great breakthroughs. But there simply haven't been any big breakthroughs since then, and drug companies have a dearth of new products. Many of their investors are very worried because they're all about to fall off a patents cliff as their blockbuster drugs go off patent. Lipitor, the statins are already off patent, Prozac's off patent. And they're obeying a law of diminishing return as well. So all is not well in the garden of science. So I think that challenging these assumptions and looking at alternatives opens up completely new perspectives. I'm just going to deal with one of them in a little bit more detail, and then we'll leave any of the others for my dialogue with Rick and the subsequent session, parts of this afternoon. The one I want to look at in more detail is the idea that matter's unconscious. I already said this came into being by definition in the 17th century. But most scientists until the 19th century were dualists. They said, okay, science deals with nature, matter's unconscious, but of course human minds are not just material things, and of course God still exists and our minds can relate to God. But God's separate from nature as our minds are, and our minds, through God-given reason, enable us to dissect and control the natural world. That was the standard assumption, and many scientists were quite devout Christians or Muslims or Jews or Hindus. They didn't see a conflict because they had two compartments. But in the 19th century, there was a growing movement of people who didn't want there to be two fundamental realities. They thought two was too many. They thought there ought to be just one. Personally, I think 2 is too few. I'm a Trinitarian, and I think we need to have at least 3 fundamental principles. But anyway, those who didn't like the untidiness of 2, thought there should only be 1, and they went in one of 2 directions. Some people said mind is the only reality. This is the philosophy of idealism. Therefore, everything is mind. Matter's just somehow dumbed down mind. But most 19th century philosophers who wanted a monism as opposed to a dualism became materialists. They said that the only reality is matter. The realm of spirit simply doesn't exist. That meant at one stroke, God and the angels were removed from reality. And an essentially atheistic philosophy came into sway. The main reasons that atheism gained ground in the 19th century in Europe, it never gained much ground in the United States till recently, but in Europe the reason it gained ground was because it provided a very strong ally of political parties that were against the established order. And particularly in countries like France and Russia, where there were reactionary political regimes allied to the established church, in France the Catholic Church, in Russia the Orthodox Church. These states were empowered by the belief that they were divinely ordained, and these churches supported the power and reactionary policies of the state. Therefore, for socialist and communist parties, the best way to undermine the power of the established order was simply to say, well, God doesn't exist. It's an illusion. There's no such thing as the realm of spirit. And these churches are just talking about absolute nonsense, superstition, things that don't exist. So this led to a decline in the power and influence of churches, a great decline in religious observance and belief, which has continued to the present day. In Britain, church attendance today is about 7% of the population. In the US, it's about 50%. The US is one of the most religious countries in the Western world. But in most of Europe, it's 10% or below. In Scandinavia, it's about 2%. 98% of the Scandinavian population has no regular religious practice. There are quite a lot of people who are spiritual but not religious. But the effect of this anti-Christian propaganda, especially in 19th century anti-clerical movements on the continent, has been to undermine the power of churches. And so many people adopted a materialist worldview, not because they'd considered the scientific facts, not because they'd thought through the philosophy, but because it was politically expedient and enabled a kind of secular worldview to become mainstream. And that's very much in place all around the world, and it's the standard default worldview of almost all educational institutions, with the exception of CIIS and religious seminaries and a few other institutions. So the idea that matter's unconscious became the only reality when the dualism gave way to the materialism in the 19th century. And in a sense, it was relatively easy to get rid of God and the angels, but they couldn't get rid of human consciousness. And so this then led to what's in 20th and 21st century philosophy of mind called the hard problem. The fact is, we're conscious. And if all matter's unconscious, we ought not to be conscious. So the main effort of materialist philosophers of mind has been to prove that our consciousness either doesn't exist or that it does nothing. Either it's an epiphenomenon, like a shadow of the activity of the brain that does nothing, or it's an illusion produced by what Patricia and Paul Churchland, California's leading philosophers of mind, like to call folk psychology. Ordinary people go on talking in terms of subjectivity, emotions, and so forth. But when materialism achieves its goals, when the promissory notes are fulfilled, we'll realize this is nothing but a kind of deluded shorthand folk language for events that can be objectively described in terms of neuroscience, objectively described in terms of brain functioning. There's a third school of materialist philosophers who say that consciousness is an illusion. My old friend Nicholas Humphrey in Britain is a member of this school. He and I have almost opposite views on almost everything, but we're still friends and we're able to discuss these things. But he says that consciousness is a kind of illusion produced by evolution in the brain. It doesn't do anything, but it makes us feel good and want to get out of bed in the mornings. And it's an illusion that it makes us enjoy the beauty of the world and all that kind of thing, because if we do that, we're happier and tend to survive better. So he gives it a function, but says it doesn't really do anything except make us feel good. The trouble is, to say that consciousness is an illusion is rather self-contradictory, because illusion is a mode of consciousness. It presupposes rather than explains consciousness. Now, because of the extreme problems of materialism, in the last few years there's been a most interesting movement going on. Materialists are jumping ship. And the first to defect from the materialist worldview among materialist philosophers of mind was a British philosopher called Galen Strawson, who argued that materialism implies panpsychism. If psyche exists, if mind exists in humans, it can't just appear miraculously from unconscious matter. There must be proto-mind or lower organizations of mental processes right back into the material world as far as electrons and subatomic particles. There must be some kind of mental aspect to all nature. A more recent convert to that view is Thomas Nagel, one of America's leading philosophers of mind at Columbia, who 3 years ago produced a book called Mind and Cosmos: Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False. Caused a furore among philosophers. He was denounced in the most incredibly inflammatory language by people like Steven Pinker and Daniel Dennett for betraying science, reason, and philosophy. And he's actually an honest man trying to, if you read his book, which I have done, it ends exactly where I'd like it to begin, but you see somebody trying to claw their way out of this materialist trap. And he ends up by saying there must be some other aspect to nature, there must be another way of understanding mind, the panpsychism must be in some sense true, although I don't know quite how it's true and in what way, and there must be some inherent teleology or purpose in nature. He remains an atheist, but he thinks that the facts of the matter force one to those conclusions. Most recently, one of the most hardcore materialist neuroscientists, Christoph Koch, came out in favor of panpsychism in an article in Scientific American last year. And it's now a kind of swelling movement in the materialist ranks. The trouble is that none of them are very clear about how panpsychism might work. And I'm going to end this introductory section by just saying a few words about the most interesting panpsychist philosopher of the 20th century, Alfred North Whitehead. I'm sure you discuss him in your program here. But Alfred North Whitehead was one of the first philosophers to realize the implications of quantum theory, partly because he was the only philosopher who really understood mathematics. He started as a mathematician, and with his student Bertrand Russell, produced a book, Principia Mathematica, a key book in the philosophy of mathematics in the 20th century. When quantum theory got going in the 1920s, Whitehead realized immediately that if electrons and other quantum particles are waves, which is what quantum theory was saying, then they have time within them. You see, previously people thought that matter was made up of solid little bits, like miniature billiard balls, particles that just persisted in time. But if they're waves, they're processes. And as Whitehead pointed out, a wave takes time to wave. You can't have a wave at an instant. You know, just think of waves on the ocean. When you see them, if you had an infinitesimal slice of a wave, it's not a wave anymore. It's, you have to go through at least one wavelength to know that it's a wave or what kind of wave it is, and that one wavelength takes time. So it also means that insofar as quantum particles are waves, you can't precisely localize them in space or time. And this is the ultimate reason for the so-called uncertainty principle in quantum mechanics. Whitehead realized, therefore, that even at the most fundamental level, matter is a process, not a thing. And if it's a process in time. And if it's a process in time, then it has a past pole and a future pole. And we are processes in time as well. So I think this is one of the most interesting insights of Whitehead, because he showed that here is a clue to the so-called mind-body problem. Normally, people discuss the relation of mind and body in terms of spatial metaphors. The mind is inside, the body is outside, the external world, the inner life. We're used to this kind of talk. We've all talked in that way, I'm sure. But it's a spatial metaphor for mind. He thought that the best way of understanding it was in terms of time, that the future pole is the mental pole, the past pole is the physical pole, that the relation of mind and body is a relation in time. The mind, the mental pole, is to do with possibilities. Possibilities don't yet exist. Possibilities are not material things. And the Schrödinger equation, which describes what will happen to an electron, it's at the fundamental level of quantum mechanics, is an equation which describes all the possible things that electron could do. As soon as the electron interacts with anything, measuring apparatus or a molecule or anything else, or the screen on an old-style TV set, all those possibilities collapse down to an observable fact. It's sometimes called the collapse of the wave function. And this collapse of the possibilities to an observable fact is what happens when you move from the mental pole. A decision or a change comes about so that a decision among these possibilities is made, maybe by chance, maybe by choice, until a decision is made and a fact comes into being, but it's now in the past. When you detect the electron on a screen or an electron detector, it's already in the past. The same applies to us. Our minds are primarily concerned with possibilities. Our consciousness is an arena of possibility. Our dreams, too, are about possibilities, not actualities. And one of the things our minds do, the principal thing, according to this interpretation of Whitehead, is to choose among possibilities. That's what our consciousness is about. And so, for example, every one of us chose to be here today. When we were deciding whether to be here or not, there were many other possible things we could have done this Sunday afternoon. But out of those many possibilities, we chose to be here. And having chosen to be here and having put our decisions into action, we are here. And the fact we're here is an observable physical fact. We can be weighed, measured, photographed, etc., where we are right now. But the process that led to this was through a realm of possibility leading to a decision. And now our minds are concerned with future and other possibilities. I'm talking about new possibilities for science, for example. Anyway, I think that this approach is a really helpful one. And when we extend this panpsychist view to larger physical systems, we get into very interesting territory. I mean, most discussions focus on electrons, and for most of us it's a bit of a stretch to imagine the conscious life of an electron. But it gets much more interesting when we think about big self-organizing systems, not small ones. The whole of the Earth, for example, is a self-organizing system, Gaia. And the one that I'm most interested in is the Sun. Because from this point of view, the Sun as a self-organizing system will have a mind. The Sun will be conscious. Now, for most modern people, the idea of the Sun's conscious is something they haven't thought about at all. I once asked my friend Martin Rees, Martin, have you ever considered the possibility that the Sun's conscious? And he looked up from his Sunday Times that he was reading. He said, the Sun conscious? And I said, yes. And he said, of course not. And that was the end of the discussion. See, any educated person, and everyone in this room has been through the educational system, then knows that to say the Sun's conscious is animistic, involves anthropomorphic projections, is a primitive mode of thought. All traditional peoples believe the Sun is conscious. Indians believe the Sun is conscious. Surya is the sun god. Many Hindus every day start their day with the prostrations to the Sun, Surya Namaskar. It's a yoga exercise. I do it myself, and I'm sure some of you do it. The most important, one of the most important mantras of Hinduism, the Gayatri mantra, is an invocation to the sun, the divine light of the sun to illuminate our meditation. But all of that's primitive, superstitious, and we as modern people have risen above it. We now know that the sun is nothing but a hydrogen bomb governed by physical laws with electrical activity going on its surface. But what if the sun is actually conscious? You see, it's hard even to ask the question, because the prejudice against asking it is reinforced in our culture by the fact that children think it's conscious, or at least implicitly. When they draw the sun, they draw it with a smiley face. So that proves it's primitive, childish, and superstitious. And okay, these people used to believe that. It was a mythological mode of thought that science has led us beyond to a new and better view of the rational, scientific view of the world. But do we really know the sun's unconscious? No one's ever done a single experiment, and I've never seen even a single discussion of the subject within any scientific literature, except to dismiss the very possibility as a childish superstition. But if the sun's conscious, then we arrive at a completely new way of thinking. What kind of decisions could it make? If its consciousness, like ours, is concerned with possibilities and choosing among them. Well, I'm not suggesting that it can choose what orbit to follow. I don't think it can decide to deviate one way or the other from its regular orbit. But it has a huge amount of electrical activity within it, like our brains do, but much more complex than our brains. It shoots out solar flares and coronal mass ejections. It has 11-year sunspot cycles. All these things are highly variable, so variable that NASA has an online site with solar weather, because if it shoots solar flares out towards the Earth, they can cause power blackouts and interruption of communication systems. The sun can modulate what's happening in the solar system through these activities, and it may do so consciously. If the sun's doing that, so are other stars. All of the stars may have mental activity, minds, just as people thought in the Middle Ages. And if the stars have minds, then what about galaxies, which are even higher level self-organizing systems? The stars are like cells in the bodies of the galaxy. And the whole galaxy may have a mind, a galactic mind. Maybe the equivalent of the brain is at the galactic center, or the heart, which is an immensely energetic center of every galaxy that sends out power, plasma currents and magnetic field lines along the spiral arms, affecting everything within the galaxy. And then, if all the galaxies are conscious, what about the entire universe? The cosmic mind. What's the cosmic mind doing? You see, there's nothing that makes this unscientific. It's simply not something discussed within existing science. But nowhere within existing institutions will you find, except CIAS, will you find discussions of this kind of issue. Because it's simply not on the agenda because of the taboo against it. I think when we break out of these taboos, and that's just one example of one of the taboos that I've discussed, entirely new possibilities open up for scientific investigation. And I think we've been liberated from this constricting philosophy of nature. And I think that our whole attitude to nature would be regenerated. I think the sciences themselves would be regenerated. I think all of this is good for science. I'm saying these things not because I'm anti-science, but because I'm pro-science. I spent my entire career in scientific research. I'm very pro-science. But I just think it's terrible the way that it's got so locked into these dogmatic points of view and that they're constricting science itself in such a limiting way. And I think it won't be long before we break out of them, because the old dogmas are breaking down in almost every area of science. I mentioned already the way they're breaking down in genetics and the theory of inheritance. And the same is true right across the board. But most people don't yet realize that we're entering a post-materialist world. There is a website which deals with this. Last year, a number of scientists and medical researchers gathered in Tucson, Arizona. We had something called the Summit on Post-Materialist Science. And one of the things we did was set up a website, which I recommend you take a look at, called opensciences.org. opensciences.org. because there's now increasing numbers of people within the sciences who think along the lines I've been describing. And this website, it mentions educational institutions where you can learn about these things, funding agencies that help fund research in these areas. And there's a who's who of open-minded scientists with profiles of them. And there's a manifesto for post-materialist science, which has been signed by dozens of scientists within educational and medical institutions. So it's still small, but there is a growing movement now, and I think we're on the threshold of a massive paradigm change. Thank you.
This next part we'll just have as an open dialogue and discussion. Anybody who has questions for Rupert, we'll do this for 40, 45 minutes, take another break, and then Rupert will present some of his most recent research in the area of telepathy that he's been doing with one of our own, Tom Stedall. Many of you know Tom Stedall, who was part of our PCC community here for a year, and he's back now in the UK. And so anyway, Rupert will talk about that. But let's just open up to any questions, comments on what Rupert's already presented to us. I'll just maybe, is it helpful to have people use the microphone to ask the questions? Okay.
So last year, our Academy of Science had a planetarium exhibition on dark matter and dark energy. And I was struck as I was looking at how they, previously thought that space was just empty, and then they used a specific radio telescope to look and see that actually it's all this beautiful connective tissue that looked very much, to my eye, like neural synapses in the brain. So I'm just wondering if you're tracking that, and that really resonated as you were talking about the consciousness of the universe and the consciousness of the galaxies, and seeing that and seeing how it maps or reflects in our own neural synapses.
Yes. Well, yes, I have indeed been tracking the dark matter and dark energy thing, partly in relation to the doctrine that the total amount of matter and energy is always the same. In the 1980s, when people discovered that galaxies weren't working as they thought they should, they were attracting each other too much, stars were moving around the center too fast. This suggested there was something wrong with the standard model of galaxies. And I think there's something wrong with it for a different reason. I think if they're self-organizing systems or organisms, there'd be a morphogenetic field organizing what's going on. But the standard assumption was it must be gravitational, just gravity that's organizing them, and there wasn't enough gravity to explain what they were doing. So the assumption there was to put in dark matter into the equations to explain the phenomena. And then when it came to the question of how much dark matter, then it was simple. You just titrate in the right amount to make the equations balance. So it came out to be about 5 times as much as regular matter. And nobody jumped up and down and said, that's terrible, you're introducing 5 times more matter into the universe than there was last year. That defies the law of conservation of matter. No one protested, and they got away with it. I think really dark matter is a kind of placeholder. It's not actually being detected. It's a placeholder for what we don't know about galaxies. And that's why I think it's interesting. Personally, I'm skeptical of whether it really exists. There are certainly connections between galaxies that suggest interrelationships. But whether you can't see dark matter by definition, that's why it's called dark matter. Then they had the problem, having introduced all this extra matter into the universe, it was 5 times heavier than before. That meant that the cosmic expansion ought to be slowing down because there was more matter to pulling it together again. And until about 1999, people thought that the universe would slow down as it expanded, stop, and then begin to contract faster and faster until it all ended in tears, in the opposite of the Big Bang, called the Big Crunch. And but in around 1999, 2000, observations of distant galaxies showed that far from slowing down, the expansion of the universe was speeding up. So how do you explain that? Well, introduce dark energy, a hitherto unobserved form of dark energy which pushes the universe apart. Dark matter and dark energy are now believed to constitute 96% of all matter and energy in the universe. The energy and matter we learned about at school is only 4% of reality according to contemporary physics. And it's as if they've discovered the cosmic unconscious. And I think these dark matter and dark energy, as I say, are sort of placeholders for things that are utterly unknown. In fact, they're believed to be unknown. They say we don't yet fully understand the nature of the dark matter and dark energy. And attempts to detect dark matter experimentally have been very unsuccessful so far. Occasionally you say someone got a blip on some detector that suggests it might be there, but then it turns out that it isn't really there, or at least the blip was the wrong kind of blip. I track them because I think that what they are is an admission by physics of a radical incompleteness of existing theory. They've had to insert unobserved substances which constitute the vast majority of supposed physical reality. The other thing is that the theory itself now defies the law of conservation of matter and energy, because the equations for dark energy, which are the standard equations that most cosmologists use, say that the total amount of dark energy in a given unit of space is constant. But since the universe is expanding, the total amount of space is expanding, therefore the total amount of dark energy is increasing. So in fact, the amount of dark energy in the universe is increasing all the time, which makes the universe a perpetual motion machine, which defies this principle. So the whole thing is a terrible mess, and is one of the problems. Physics is in crisis at the moment, partly because the entire cosmological explanation depends on these completely unobserved principles, partly because the most important theoretical structure in physics, superstring theory or M theory, on which 80% of theoretical physics is based, yields no testable results and has equations that would apply to 10 to the 500 power of 500 universes. And it's so general that it makes no testable predictions at all. So a lot of physicists are now saying, is this science? And then there's the multiverse universe problem, where many physicists are now postulating trillions of unobserved universes without a shred of evidence. So some of the more radical physicists are questioning the entire enterprise. The best general introduction to this situation is Lee Smolin's book, The Trouble with Physics. He's a cosmologist who's more sensitive than most to the problems with physics. And there are quite a number of the more thoughtful members of the physics community who think it's completely lost its way. So I think it is worth tracking what's happening in these areas, but not for quite the same reasons as most physicists think. Yes.
Thank you. So, speaking of which, I would be curious to hear, as you were discussing, whether there has been more recent breakthroughs and ground met in that regard about electric universe theory, and namely electromagnetic field forces, actually in contrast to this historically held model actually being stronger than gravity and such things like that.
Well, not everyone may know about the electric universe. How many people have heard about the electric universe theory? Well, a small minority. But that's in itself interesting, you see, because the way science works at the moment is that there's a kind of overwhelming orthodoxy in each branch of science. And because it's based on a kind of totalitarian winner-takes-all model, as opposed to a pluralistic model, the dominant orthodoxy gets all the grants, controls all the journals, etc. And almost every branch of science has sort of dissident groups have been extruded onto the into the fringes. Within psychology, for example, parapsychology has been extruded from academic psychology. It's a kind of treated as a fringe group, often of no scientific value at all. Now, there's a similar situation with cosmology. There's this group called the Electric Universe, who they have conferences, they have a website, the Electric Universe, and they have a radically different view of the way the cosmos works. I've been to a couple of their conferences, and I found them absolutely fascinating, because many people within them are electrical engineers, physicists, cosmologists. Some of them are mythologists, so people who study myth and think that this, they tie it into some ancient myths and about changes in, slightly like von Däniken, the idea that there were changes in planetary orbits, which are actually becoming increasingly favored. I mean, the conventional theory of the moon right now is that the moon was formed by a vast asteroid hitting the Earth and, as it were, causing a splash of matter out of the Earth, which became the moon. I mean, that's the mainstream theory. So the idea of huge collisions and changes in orbits is pretty mainstream. But the Electric Universe people argue that instead of the galaxies being organized primarily by gravitation, which has been the basis of cosmology since Sir Isaac Newton, instead, the main organizing forces are these vast electric currents, which everyone agrees really exist. There are incredibly active, energetic centers of generating energy in the hearts of galaxies, the galactic center, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. And there are enormous electric currents going through the plasma in the interstellar gas, through the arms of galaxies, vast electric currents stretching over millions of light years associated with magnetic field lines, millions of light years long, vast magnetic fields. And they think that the galaxies are controlled and organized through these magnetic and electrical forces which have their source in the galactic center. Now, that seems to be entirely reasonable, and it fits the facts much better than the conventional view that it's all gravity and anything that can't be explained by gravity must be explained by dark matter, which can be added in arbitrarily to explain any anomaly. If a galaxy has an unexpected bulge, then you say, well, there must be a lot of dark matter there that's pulling it out. You can explain everything with dark matter, but it's totally untestable. The Electric Universe people also they like the work of a dissident cosmologist called Halton Arp, A-R-P, who is an American cosmologist who is best known for his catalogue of anomalous galaxies. Quite a number of galaxies are called after him, you know, ARP 507 and that sort of thing. So he's the leading American cosmologist until he came up with a heretical theory that led to him being extruded from the mainstream community and marginalized. And what he said was that if you look at the facts of the matter, the usual assumption is that the expansion of the universe leads to the redshift in objects as things move away from the Earth through the Doppler effect. Their light, the spectrum of their light is shifted towards the red. It's called the redshift. And things that are very distant from us have high redshifts of 6 or 7. Things that are very close have redshifts of 0.1, 0.2, etc. A redshift of about 6 or 7 is enormous and implies that something's extremely distant. Well, the most energetic objects in the universe are called quasars, quasi-stellar objects. And quasars give out huge amounts of energy. They also have enormous redshifts. Most of them have redshifts of 5 or 6. And this implies that quasars are not only very energetic, but even hyper-energetic, almost inconceivably energetic, because if we can detect them so far away, and they have these huge redshifts, they're completely unlike anything that's near to us. And the usual assumption is that these must be extraordinary, anomalous objects that are far, far away, receding from us very fast. But Halton-Arp came up with a different theory. He thought that the redshifts of quasars had nothing to do with them moving away from us. He thought that quasars were newly minted matter spat out of these energetic cores of galaxies, often spat out on both sides of the galaxy. You often see quasars, one on either side of a galactic center. And that the reason they have a redshift is because it's what he calls the intrinsic redshift, that he thought newly minted matter has a redshift because its existence hasn't yet been detected by the rest of the universe. It can only be detected at the speed of light, and as the rest of the universe registers it, it reduces its redshift. Now that, I can't comment on the technical details of that theory, but this is Halton-Arp's theory. And the electric universe people are very keen on Halton-Arp's theory. Halton-Arp himself wrote a book about this called Seeing Red, which is it's spoilt by the fact he was extremely embittered by the treatment. As soon as he came up with this theory, he couldn't get time on telescopes, he couldn't get grants, he couldn't get his papers published in journals. This extreme intolerance that's characteristic of science, because of the lack of a pluralistic model. The idea is science has a universal truth about all the universe. Therefore, you can't have two lots of cosmology. You can only have one at any given time. And scientific revolutions are usually, as in Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, are usually conceived of as being rather like those old-style Latin American revolutions where one military junta is replaced by another. It's still a dictatorship. That's an aside. But anyway, the Halton-Arp's views are part of the electric universe theory, and their most radical theory, the one I found completely intriguing when I heard a talk on it at one of their conferences, is that the sun is not powered from within, as conventionally believed by the hydrogen bomb theory, but powered from without. That there are huge electric currents passing through the universe. They enter the whole sphere of the solar system. They pass through, they're attracted towards the sun. And the light of the sun, most of it's generated by something a bit like lightning moving into the sun from outside. And the proponents of this theory have quite good arguments. The photosphere, the surface of the sun that we see, has a temperature of about 5,000 degrees centigrade. The corona that you see during eclipses, the gaseous bits around it, which you can't see normally, have temperatures of about 5 million degrees centigrade. So how come, as you get further from the center, where the energy is supposed to be produced, the temperature, instead of going down, goes up so dramatically? Well, the theory that the sun's powered from outside makes more sense of that than the existing theory, which keeps changing. They say, oh, well, it's caused by the reconnection of magnetic field lines. That's the usual theory. You say, well, how exactly does that work? And when you ask the questions, then you say, oh, well, so-and-so thinks it happens this way, but we think it happens this way. And then another critic says, no, they've got it all wrong. So it's not as if there's an agreed theory of reconnection of magnetic field lines. It's an attempt to explain a phenomenon that simply doesn't fit into the existing model. So the electric universe theory, I think, has many merits, but it's been completely excluded from the official astronomy thing. And well, I use my friend Martin Rees as a kind of sounding board. So I said to him once, what do you think about Halton-Arp? And he said, well, he said he used to be eminent cosmologist, but he's completely discredited. No one takes him seriously anymore. I said, no one. He said, well, within the mainstream physics community, no one. And that was it. I said, well, can you tell me why? He said, oh, I can't waste time on the details. So this is, this heresy-creating mechanism that's so well established in science. So it's very interesting that currently they've got some funding and they're building a model of the sun in a huge plasma chamber, and they're trying to make models of plasma discharges to model how this energy system could work. Let me just say in parenthesis that I was at a fascinating meeting about 3 years ago in Albuquerque, New Mexico, that was convened by the Electric Universe people. And after it, they had a one-day invited symposium of about 6 or 7 people. I was one of them. An eminent professor of physics from Washington State University was another. Dean Radin was one. And there were somebody from the Department of Defense, someone from the Lockheed Corporation, someone from a think tank in Washington. And the basic thing was a discussion about the innovation deficit in science. What can be done because the structure of science is set up in such a way that it inhibits innovations, as I've mentioned already, for ideological reasons. But also, they identified this as being, in this discussion, the think tanks have identified the main reason as being what they call perverse incentives. Within the scientific world, the way you build a career, the way you get your grants, the way you get promoted, the way you get top jobs, is through the number of citations to your papers in peer-reviewed journals. The number of papers times the citation index gives a quantitative measure, which gives your status in the scientific world and is what your career is all about. It has nothing to do with making the world a better place, breakthroughs that could change technology or anything like that. It's to do with citations within the peer-reviewed literature, quantified. Now, if you work in an innovative field of science, which by definition won't have many people working in it, you won't get many citations because there aren't many people in the field. You'll get the most citations if you work in highly populated areas of science like string theory or molecular genetics. So this favors people working in conventional areas, and it's perverse incentive for non-innovation. Anyway, there's a chap called Gerald Pollack, who's a professor at the University of Washington, works on water, has very innovative work on properties of water, who launched the idea for something called the Institute for Venture Science, for which he's been trying to collect billions of dollars from aging Silicon Valley billionaires on the principle they can't take it with them, and the best thing they could do if they believe in innovation is to give the money to a fund that could actually encourage innovation. And his argument is that in every branch of science there are these extruded, marginalized groups like the Electric Universe, parapsychology. Within the water research, there's a whole group of water researchers who have been, including memory of water people, who have been squeezed out of the academic mainstream. He said these are the low-hanging fruits. He said if I had a fund with several $1 billion, he said what we should do is fund all these marginalized groups, not just one lab, but several labs within each group, because these are the places where there's most likely to be breakthroughs. They're areas where serious people have spent years and endangered their own careers doing innovative research, where these are the areas innovation will come from, and by doing that, science would be transformed. I think he's completely right. And the Electric Universe is precisely one such group. So this is a long answer to your question, but I think that the Electric Universe group is I mean, it's interesting, even here, very few people know about it because it could have a bearing on, cosmology and some of the things that you discuss. But it's simply not on the radar for most people because the scientific media, science journalists don't report anything done in these conferences. They're treated as fringe or, crank or something not taken seriously. You wouldn't read about it in the New York Times or Scientific American or anything like that. And most politicians and funding agencies and professors and intellectuals get their information from these kinds of organs, serious journalist organs. And serious scientific journalists would never report on these things.
Rupert, in your view, is the main problem just that the scientific establishment isn't researching the right topics, or that there's not funding to perform the right sorts of experiments in these various peripheral fields and disciplines that you're talking about? Or is there a deeper problem with the scientific method itself as we've inherited it, from the scientific revolution. And I'm thinking here of, say, like, the famous poet and statesman Goethe was also a scientist and developed his own sort of alternative method, and was in fierce debates against Newtonian scientists about his theory of color. And it seems like his approach to science, his method of doing science, is more participatory and based on a more sort of Renaissance idea that there's a sympathy between the mind and the wider natural realm, whereas the more Cartesian and Newtonian method of science it's highly mathematical and quantitative and seems to rule out in advance certain discoveries along the lines of, say, panpsychism or whatnot. So is it a problem with just not doing the right kind of research, or with the scientific method as we've inherited it itself?
Well, I think, first of all, the scientific method is very different in different branches of science. For example, in plant taxonomy, where you're classifying plants, the ultimate reference specimens are in the great herbaria, like in Kew Gardens in London. And if you find a plant species in the Amazon, you don't know whether it's an existing one or not. You send the specimen to an expert at Kew, and they look in the herbarium and compare it with an existing collections and so on. That's not quantitative at all. There's no equation for a hibiscus plant or a foxglove or a palm tree. It's not done quantitatively. It can't be done quantitatively. And so in practice, large branches of science, especially taxonomic sciences, are not quantitative. They're based on observation and direct experience. An experienced plant taxonomist can look at a plant and know what it is based on the gestalt, the form, the shape, the feel of the plant. So the scientific method as we have it already admits a kind of phenomenological approach in plant and animal morphology and taxonomy. Now, admittedly, those traditional classical branches of science, like Linnaeus and the kind of things you see in natural history museums, are very out of fashion at the moment. They still exist. But in Kew Gardens, all the young scientists there do molecular taxonomy, where they analyze the DNA of different species. I was talking to the mushroom researcher Paul Stamets recently. He's a friend of mine. And I met him in London a couple of years ago. He came to a fungus conference at Kew, which I was also at. And he was having a tough time with the young researchers there. And I asked him why. I asked him just a few weeks ago, and I saw him in Canada. And he said the problem was they were frightened of him. A senior researcher told him afterwards, these guys are frightened of you. And he said, why? He said, because when someone comes into Kew with a mushroom and says, what's this? He said, none of them have the faintest idea. They say to them, give us the mushroom, we'll analyze the DNA, and we'll get back to you next week. And whereas Paul Stamets, show him the mushroom, he immediately knows what it is. The young molecular taxonomists cannot recognize actual mushrooms. It's the same again with my friend Martin Rees, who I went out one night into his garden. The stars were particularly bright, and I said, Martin, what's that constellation up there? He said, oh, don't ask me, I'm an astronomer. That's stuff for amateurs. Just recognizing it by seeing it isn't what he does. It's radio astronomy, looking at bleeps on charts and stuff. The people, if you want to know what the stars are, you ask amateur navigators, or if you want to know what plants are, as in Kew Gardens, as the old plant taxonomists retire, and the new ones, the molecular ones, take over, they've got a serious problem now. They've got fewer and fewer people around who can actually identify anything. And they realize they've got to go back to teaching classical morphology. So I think the scientific method has always been open to many different approaches. Most of medicine is based on case histories, which are essentially anecdotes. An anecdote is by definition an unpublished story. An means not, ekdotos means published in Greek. But when they're published, they're promoted to the rank of case history. And even in modern medical journals, I did a survey recently of medical journals, only about 25% of the papers are placebo-controlled double-blind trials. Most of them are still case histories. And that's a doctor saying, you know, the patient came in, they presented with these symptoms, we treated them with this drug, and this is what happened. That's not very quantitative, and it's not like the standard sort of entry-level philosophy of science, you know, hypothesis, quantitative tests. A lot of science has never worked that way. And experimental psychology doesn't really work that way either, because you have to rely on people reporting on subjective experiences. And a lot of consciousness studies is now looking at actual experiences. So I think there's already a great diversity of methods within science. So I don't think that it's the methods that are so much the problem. I think there's already a good case being made in consciousness studies for taking seriously the reports of meditators, people who've had near-death experiences, out-of-the-body experiences, and so forth. I think the main, it's not even that most scientists are convinced that the materialist worldview is correct. I worked for 7 years in India as a scientist. I worked in an agricultural institute, the International Agricultural Institute in Hyderabad. My Indian colleagues, who were almost all of them Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Parsis, etc., I didn't encounter a single colleague among my colleagues who was a materialist and an atheist when they were off duty. When they were off duty, they reverted to being Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, etc. When they were on duty, they just went along with the standard materialist assumptions because they knew that that's the way to get on in their careers. They didn't believe it at any deep level. There's lots and lots of scientists who'd be only too pleased if the mechanistic paradigm were overthrown. Even in the West, I think it's only a minority who really believe in it. So I think the main constraints are the career structure, the perverse incentives, the funding system, and the hyper-specialization that science involves, where you study one branch of science and then a sub-branch and then a sub-branch and a sub-branch. By the time you've got a PhD in science, you've narrowed down to such a narrow level of specialization that you don't have any big picture of, you know, the larger overview of things. So I see the main constraints as institutional and sociological rather than actual methods. I myself, in my own research on telepathy and morphic resonance, although these are unconventional hypotheses, I use actually fairly conventional statistics and methods because there's not much chance of getting unconventional ideas and evidence accepted if the methods are unconventional too. But conventional methods are good enough for many of the things that I do, and I'll talk later about how the things I'm doing at the moment, which don't involve a challenge to the idea of statistical methodology or controlled experiments. They're just using them to investigate phenomena that are not normally investigated.
Rupert, could you
Yes.
share that story about when you talked to a group of people who are academics, one by one coming up to you?
Oh yes, I will. Yes. So, my own experience. I'm quite often asked to give talks in scientific institutions and university departments and so on, which I do. And it's when I give my talks on, you know, telepathy research or morphic resonance research or the extended mind or the sense of being stared at or dogs that know when their owners are coming home, these kinds of talks on these sorts of subjects. Usually people listen. I usually get a big audience and people listen, you know, with real interest. Sometimes one or two people get outraged within the first few minutes and say, this is nonsense and this ought not to be happening here, and walk out and slam the door. They're kind of dogmatic skeptic types. And I've had that happen quite often actually, but it's only one or two. Most people, and then when it comes to the questions, they usually ask quite polite questions, you know, how did you do the statistics with this, and did you do that controlled experiment with that, and so, which I can answer. It's in the normal form of scientific seminar. But afterwards, during the tea break, is where it gets interesting. It's one after another. People come up to me, and they look both ways to see if no one's listening. And they say, what you said about dogs knowing when their owners are coming home is really interesting, because my dog always knows when I'm coming home from the laboratory. Or someone else says, what you said about telephone telepathy really applies to me. I always know when my wife's calling. So person after person comes up and says, but they then say, but I can't tell my colleagues about this because they're all so straight. And once, I gave a talk on dogs that know when their owners are coming home in Cambridge at the veterinary school to the companion animal research subgroup. Now, companion animals is the academic word for pets. And so there were 6 staff members and a few graduate students. And a few other students. So it was quite a small seminar. It's a small group because in veterinary medicine, companion animals are right at the bottom end of the pecking order. What gets the big bucks are, mass factory farming practices, antibiotic doses for factory farm chickens. I mean, there's billions of dollars involved in that, whereas there's much less involved in the pet sector of veterinary medicine. So in vet schools, they're like the lowest in the hierarchy. So anyway, I gave the evidence, I had the polite questions, the statistics, the controlled experiments, yes, we did that experiment, here are the results, and so on. Then during the tea break, one after another they came up. One person said, when I was a kid, we had a dog that knew when my father was coming home, and that's what got me so interested in animals, and that's why I'm a vet now. Another one said, my dog knows when I'm coming home from the lab, but I can't talk to my colleagues about it because they're all so straight. Another one said, I'm really interested in this, and I think I'm telepathic too, but I can't tell my colleagues because they're all so straight. And when all 6 members of staff, including the professor, had said the same thing to me, and I said to them, why don't you guys come out? Because you'd have so much more fun. So I think that the biggest scientific revolution that could happen would be one that could be facilitated by people who are skilled in social facilitation and group work, a coming out movement among scientists. Because there aren't that many who really believe this stuff, and yet most of them think everyone else is completely straight, and so they can't talk about it. And it's just like gays in the 1950s. There were lots of people who were gay who were at work, when at work, pretended to be straight, and there are other gays pretending to be straight, and it's so unnecessary. So I've actually been talking to Deepak Chopra about something that I think could really move things forward. It hasn't happened yet, and I talked to Marilyn Schlitz about this, Institute of Noetic Sciences. Maybe it's something that CIIS could be involved in, because what I was suggesting is Gallup poll type surveys of practicing scientists and doctors, asking them, have you had a psychic experience? Have you ever known who was calling on the phone? Have you had an out-of-body experience? Have you had a mystical experience? Have you had altered states of consciousness through psychedelics? Have you ever been to an alternative medical practitioner? Do you meditate? Do you have a religious practice, etc.? I think if you ask those questions, it would probably be a majority of people who had one or more of those practices that go against the materialist paradigm. And if surveys were carried out and published, I think it would empower people in science and medicine to come out. Interestingly, in Britain, one of the groups where this coming out process has got furthest, slightly surprisingly, is among psychiatrists. I was asked about 5 or 6 years ago to go and give a talk to a special interest group called the Spirituality Special Interest Group of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, which is one of the main professional organizations in Britain for psychiatrists. It has about 7,000 members. And I expected to walk into a room with about 20 people. And in fact, I walked into a room, it was a big lecture theatre in London University, and there were about 300 people. And I talked about my research on telepathy, the extended mind. Peter Fenwick talked about near-death experiences. There was a discussion about meditation and so on. There was a small one-day symposium. And during the tea break, I asked the organizers, I said, I'm amazed you've got so many members. And he said, yes. He said, this is the fastest growing special interest group in the Royal College of Psychiatrists. We have 1,000 members. That was 5 years ago. It's now about 2,500. It's like a third of the Royal College of Psychiatrists have joined this professional special interest group. And because it's called the Spirituality Special Interest Group, it enables them to come out and talk to their colleagues about telepathy and meditation and religious experiences and so on, in a way that they couldn't have done 10 years ago. And that's a good model. It's happening among medical practitioners in Britain too. There was a conference I went to 2 or 3 years ago in Cheltenham called Medicine Unboxed. It was for doctors and psychiatrists. It was about medicine outside the box. And these were a weekend conference. These were all practicing regular doctors and psychiatrists. I was one of the speakers, and there were several other speakers who were really going way beyond the standard model. And these people loved it. The discussion groups were very lively. They had a great time talking to each other in the break. Because they'd all signed up for this conference, the normal taboos had been left behind. And I got a really optimistic feeling, the fact that this is happening among medical practitioners, and there are accepted forums run by doctors, which they can claim as continuing educational professional development credits, was really interesting to me. I think the medical professions are ahead of the straight sciences, but if anyone here has any opportunity to organize such things within universities or scientific institutions, now or later, I think it would be well worth doing and could have a transformative effect. And this is slightly off topic, but since you asked, Rick, let me tell the story that some of you may or may not know about the Consciousness Club at the University of Washington. You know about that one, do you? Yes. That's 2 years ago, or maybe 3 years ago, I was giving a workshop in Hollyhock in Cortes Island, British Columbia, where I teach every year. And there were some students who'd come up for a conference there. They were undergraduates from the University of Washington at Bothell. And they'd got interested in altered states of consciousness, psychedelics, psychic research, consciousness studies, and they'd formed something called the Consciousness Club. And they listened to videos, they were aware of the kind of things CIIS is doing, and there was nothing in the teaching there, the official teaching, that related to these. So they formed a student society and started looking into these things and discussing them. 1 or 2 faculty members got to hear of this and were interested too, and came along. And as a result of this student pressure and an energetic faculty member called Kate Noble, they managed to get an undergraduate program in consciousness studies accredited at the university. It's now running, I think it's in its 2nd year. And this is now teaching some of the material that happens at CIIS. They're influenced by what happens here. But it was a very radical step for that to happen at their university, but it was started by a student society. Now, 6 months ago, I was approached by someone called Paul Revis in New York, who's an activist, a social activist, who's turned his attention and that of his group to science, because he thinks that science is ripe for an activist approach, and I completely agree with him. There's been no activism at all in science in terms of changing the way it's done and the way people work. And he started an organization called Set Science Free, based on my book, Science Set Free. So they have a website, setsciencefree.org. And one of their first endeavors was last year, the anniversary of the banning of my TED Talk, my banned TED Talk on the science delusion. I don't know if you know the story, but anyway, I gave a TED Talk, a TEDx talk. It was removed from their website after protests from militant atheists, Jerry Coyne and P.Z. Myers in particular. And there was a big controversy. I won't go into that now. But on the anniversary of this banning, they got up a protest at TED headquarters in New York. It was their first activist step in the Set Science Free. They got a petition among scientists with hundreds of PhD scientists signing a petition asking TED to restore my talk to their full website. And they went with placards saying "Set Science Free," etc. And they had "Set Science Free" T-shirts. And they arrived at the TED headquarters, and the security guard took in the petition, and they asked for Chris Anderson, the head of TED, to come and meet them, which he did. And they had a 15-minute conversation which was quite reasonable. They were deliberately non-provocative to him, and they tried to reason with him. And anyway, I didn't have anything to do with this, and I called Paul Revis and said, what's going on? I mean, this is great and stuff, but what's your next step? And he said, well, we're trying to think what to do next. And I said, well, look, what about the Consciousness Club idea? And I put him in touch with the people at UW Bothell. And they've now adopted this as their main program. They're now trying to set up or nucleate consciousness clubs in campuses throughout the US as a kind of way in to the academic world for trying to change the paradigm using student pressure, sort of bottom-up pressure. And this might be bad news for CIIS, because if they succeed in all the universities of the US, CIIS's unique position might be jeopardized. But
we can handle it.
I'm sure you can always be one step ahead. It would be like the think tank for all these consciousness studies programs. It would be really good if that happened, actually. But this is another sign of change that's in the air. And the fact that there are people who are committed social activists who've decided that science and science education is where they really need to be exerting pressure is quite encouraging. And the fact that this program at the University of Washington, the student society, had this effect is really encouraging, because I don't think these reforms are going to come in most places from the top down, because most faculty members are interested in advancing up the career ladder, not in getting a bad reputation for causing trouble.
So I wonder if you could elaborate on the question regarding consciousness of big self-organizing systems as it relates to humanity in the face of climate change, and the impact we do or we don't have on the consciousness developing for Gaia.
Well, that's a huge question. I don't really have a clear answer. The degree to which humanity is a self-organizing system is questionable. I mean, until fairly recently, when there were lots of different countries and so-called undiscovered tribes and people living in their own social and cultural bubbles or national bubbles, it probably wouldn't have arisen. I mean, there have always been big empires, including the Roman Empire, the British Empire, etc. And those are self-organizing systems, but no empire has ever controlled the whole world, except in the modern world, as it were, the empire of the internet, the internet companies, Google and so on, the empires of transnational corporations and so on, and the media. So we are in a new position in the sense that, first of all, there's interconnectivity that didn't exist before, and secondly, we also have political structures that unify the world, including the United Nations, which can convene conferences on climate change. Most of these organizations are not, though, self-organizing. You could argue that parts of the internet are self-organizing in the sense that many people can contribute. But most of the media and most of the political system is still controlled by relatively few people, often working in accordance with their own agendas. And so I just don't know to what degree humanity is self-organizing. Because a self-organizing system has to have boundaries. Well, humanity has boundaries. They're the boundaries of the Earth. It has to have interconnection and interrelation between parts. Well, we do have that through the media and through the economic and political organizations and the banking system and so on, and the internet. It has to have a common goal or purpose. All self-organizing systems are moving towards a telos, an attractor. Now, that's not so clear for the global system, because right now, insofar as there is one, it's just progress for the sake of progress. In other words, change that makes a profit. I mean, the best attempt I've seen to form a kind of common goal is the recent encyclical by Pope Francis, Laudato Si, which I read just last week. And it's a very amazing document because it has an extraordinarily clear analysis, it seems to me, of the earth as our common home. There's a strong emphasis on the whole earth as our common home. A radical critique of not just the neoliberal economic system and the way it promotes climate change, but the way in which the same system also leads to this growing inequality and the impoverishment of the poor and the enrichment of the rich. And that's very radical because nothing like that would ever come from neoliberal institutions or academic institutions funded by governments or banks or corporations. And he does make a great attempt to be inclusive. And there are bits of it which are not inclusive. I mean, there's one paragraph on abortion, which a lot of people, including me, don't agree with. But the great majority of it is very inclusive, and it ends with two prayers. One is a prayer that anyone could say from any spiritual tradition, and the second one is a specifically Christian prayer based on St. Francis. And the fact he's taken the name Francis, and the fact that Laudato Si, praise to the Lord, is the opening. All encyclicals are named by the first 2 or 3 words. And it opens with a quote of a hymn of St. Francis of Assisi. So the whole thing, the very opening words and the name of the encyclical are taken from St. Francis. So I think it's, of all the things I've seen, it's the most persuasive way to integrated view. And because it takes seriously the idea of the living earth, Mother Earth, our mother, the earth, he calls it, he doesn't say the Gaia hypothesis, he takes for granted that it's Mother Earth. And in his discussion of the nature of nature, he talks about the way in which all nature reflects God, the being of God is reflected in all nature. It's based on medieval theology. I'm myself extremely keen on medieval theology, and the works of St. Bonaventure on the Holy Trinity, reflected in all creatures. It's a work that until recently, I was the only person I ever met who'd heard of it, apart from specialized theologians. But in this encyclical, it's treated as canonical and completely mainstream, as if these wonderful passages written in about 1350 are totally relevant today. And he doesn't say, looking back to the Middle Ages, he says, as St. Bonaventure said. You know, it's quite wonderful, I think, the way he does it. But the last 3 days, I've been taking part, giving a workshop in Grace Cathedral with the Bishop of California, Mark Andrus, who's a most wonderful man, and who our workshop was on pilgrimage, revisioning pilgrimage, and rediscovering pilgrimage. And he went much further than I've ever gone myself, and I was very surprised by when he thought that pilgrimages and ancient pilgrimages to caves, because sacred caves were sacred places for, some of them for 10,000 years. I mean, nothing in the modern world's been a continuous site of pilgrimage for thousands and thousands of years. But these pilgrimages to the caves and the burials that happened in certain sacred places were ways of interacting with Gaia, and the ceremonies in the caves were ways in which Gaia, the consciousness of the earth, could reflect back and influence the human community. He didn't see them as just human adventures, human symbolism for human purposes, but he went far further than I've ever heard anyone go in terms of seeing these as interactions with the mind of Gaia, and the mind of Gaia expressing the mind and the will of God, because the divine presence is within the earth as it is within the stars and throughout the universe.
I should interject that Bishop Mark is a very highly regarded student in our at CIS in our PCC program.
Well, indeed, the crossover is extraordinary. I mean, some of whether or not this is a kind of standard thing in your program or not, I don't know. But I was very surprised by some of the things he said. We had the most lovely, wonderful conversations. I mean, we did a couple of dialogues as well on Friday afternoon, which we're going to release as podcasts. Those were just me and him, one of them is on the theme of his thesis here on All Souls Day. Anyway, so I would say that I think the Pope has advanced. I never expected a Pope to sort of be so out in the front and as a leader as he is in this encyclical. And his final prayer really is one about that if we're going to solve this problem, we're not just going to solve it through political institutions. We're not just going to solve it through agitation. We have to solve it with the earth. And we have to solve it, and prayers and our spiritual intention have to be part of the solution. They're not just a kind of private hobby, but unless the thing is put in its spiritual context, unless there's a common spiritual goal for humanity, there can't be a concerted effort by humanity. And therefore, for humanity and the earth to be a self-organizing system, there has to be a goal, and it has to be a system that involves a spiritual dimension, because in his view, and in St. Bonaventure's view, and indeed in my own, all systems have a spiritual dimension. It's not just an optional add-on for people who choose to go to church or to meditate or even to take psychedelics. It's an inherent part of the nature of reality. So now, I was going to say something about research in telepathy. It's from the sublime, if not to the ridiculous, at least to the more limited. But it's a much more limited area of research, but nevertheless one I think this is important. And one of the, as some of you know, my own approach to research in psychic phenomena is not to start from laboratories and artificial situations, but to start from the real world and what really seems to be going on. And as part of that, for years now, I've been building up a huge database, collecting stories from people about unexplained abilities of their pets and unexplained human psychic abilities as well. And I have now over 10,000 of these case histories on my database, which is classified in different categories. It's a FileMaker Pro database. And other such databases exist, the main one at the Rhine Research Center at Duke in North Carolina. But that was built up many years ago, and mine's probably the most up-to-date such database. And it's added to every week. People send me in stories, and I have an assistant who puts them on the database. And so I've been doing research on phenomena that many people claim have happened to them. Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home is the title of my book on unexplained powers of animals, which also covers cats that know when their owners are coming home, parrots that know when their owners are coming home, and also other telepathic abilities of animals, the sense of direction, which I think is a deeply unexplained mystery that can't be explained within the framework of existing science. Migration and homing and navigation are not explained. Attempts to say, well, we've figured it out, it's magnetism. That's the usual answer, simply don't explain it. There's, I think, a morphic field linking animals to their homes. That's another topic, and I could come back to it, but I got onto Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home because so many people told me these stories. And I've done lots of experiments on this. There's a YouTube video of one of them on my website, sheldrake.org. And last week, a children's book on this subject was released, co-authored by me and Kate Banks, who's a leading American children's writer. It's called Boy's Best Friend. And it's about an 11-year-old boy whose dog knows when he's coming home from school. And it's a well-written story, but where I come in is that when he looks it up on the internet, he finds out about my research. And then he tells his older brother that he's going to email me and ask me about his dog and how to do experiments with it. And his older brother says, he said, what makes you think that an important internationally known scientist is going to reply to you? You're only 11. And has a bet with him that I won't reply. And I do reply. And actually, in real life, I reply to children who ask me questions. I make a priority of replying to students and children. And so in the book, there's a series of, there are 14 emails from me altogether. As the story unfolds, as new things develop and as new biological questions come to his mind, he emails me and I reply in my own name. So the only downside of this book is that I'm probably going to be inundated with emails from school children. Luckily, I've got a grant to increase the amount of time my secretary can spend on Pam Smart, my assistant, can spend in dealing with this. I'm encouraging children to do their own experiments with dogs. So that's one new initiative, and relaunching this. I've failed to get anyone in any university to take up this research in pets, because whenever students get interested, over and over again, their professors have said, well, it's an interesting topic, it might be interesting to do, but if you value your scientific career, do something safe that's not going to kill your career before it's even started. But children of 10 or 11 are not worrying about scientific careers, and neither are primary school teachers. So I think the most likely way of getting this research done is precisely through children. And I've just set up a website with Kate Banks called boysbestfriend.net, where we're egging on children to do research with their pets. When the skeptics get to hear of this, I dare say I'll be accused of corrupting the minds of the young. But anyway, that's one project. And if you know any children who've got pets that know when a member of the family is coming home, encourage them to take part. Another project that came out of my database is one of the commonest kinds of telepathy that occurs in the human realm, at least one of the most strongest and biological, is between mothers and babies. Many nursing mothers have the experience that when they go back to work or when they start leaving their baby, they often have the experience that when they're away from their baby, miles away, they feel their milk let down. Their breast starts squeezing out milk. Some women feel the breast tingling. It's an oxytocin-mediated response, normally triggered by hearing their baby cry. When they're away from the baby and there's no baby crying nearby, when this happens, most mothers spontaneously assume their baby needs them. They used to just go home. Now they ring home on their cell phone. And they're often right. I did one study on this, which was very successful and showed that this was way beyond chance. But we did this with people writing it down, the babysitter and the mother writing down when the baby was distressed and when the milk letdown happened. I've now got a grant from a family foundation in Santa Barbara, California, to redo this project. I've recently hired 3 midwives, one in London, one in Cambridge, and one in Canada, in British Columbia, to recruit nursing mothers whose milk lets down when they're away from the baby. And we're going to film the babies when they're away from the baby. So we've got a continuous monitoring using webcams. This is so easy now, so cheap, with the exact time. And when the mothers feel their milk let down, they're going to do a selfie with their smartphone, which will record the time, saying, my milk's letting down now. So we'll have an exact record of the timing for the statistical analysis. We'll also be able to edit it into split-screen films, which we could put on YouTube. So if on one side you see the baby, and it's in its crib, and it wakes up and starts crying, on the other side, the mother says, wow, my milk's just let down. And so these things could go viral on YouTube. So that's one project. But the ones I most wanted to talk about are projects which the main one is a project I'm doing with Dr. Tom Steadall, who was here at CIIS, and who's now working with me part-time on my new telepathy project. This is a telephone telepathy project. I've done quite a lot of research on telephone telepathy in the past, all of which has had positive, significant results. It's been replicated in the universities of Amsterdam and Freiburg, so there's already a literature on this. But the phenomenon, for those of you who are not familiar with the experiments, is the basic phenomenon is what most people have experienced. you think of someone for no apparent reason, then the phone rings, you answer it, and it's them. You say, "It's funny, I was just thinking about you." Or when the phone rings, you just know who it is before you look at the caller ID. Our surveys have shown that at least 80% of the population in the US and Britain have had these experiences. Telepathy is on the increase in the modern world because technology is on the increase, this much more widespread use of phones. Well, we've done lots of experiments on this, and you can see one of them on a YouTube video on my website, an experiment I did with a girl pop band, the Nolan Sisters, for British television. But the new test uses a state-of-the-art telephone operating system called Twilio, and it works on landlines or mobiles. And how it works is this. 3 people take part. You register online on my website, sheldrake.org. There's a section called Participate, and you go there and you'll find the telephone telepathy test. We launched it in the US 2 or 3 weeks ago, so this is quite new. And so I'd encourage all of you to have a go if you can. You just need 2 other people to do it with. It explains it on the website, and then when you start the test, it explains what's going to happen. Say I was doing it with 2 other people, or say with Rick and John, just to take a random sample. Then I'd put in their names, Rick, and me, and John, and my name, and the phone numbers, landline or mobile. And then as soon as you register, the test begins. The computer rings up all 3 of us, and we're then talking to each other like a conference call. And it then explains the test. And then after we've talked to each other for about 45 seconds, it says, trial 1 will begin now. And when trial 1 begins, each of us gets separate instructions. We can't hear each other anymore. So Rick might get a message saying, "You are the caller in this test, and you're going to be calling John, so please think about John." And John gets a message saying, "You are not the caller in this test. One of the other, you are the receiver. One of the other 2 people is going to be calling you, and please guess who that is." And he has about 20 or 30 seconds to decide. And then after 20 or 30 seconds, it says, "Please guess who's calling you. Press 1 for Rick, press 2 for Rupert." So he guesses. And as soon as he's guessed, the line opens up, and in this case, he'd immediately be talking to Rick, and Rick would say, "Oh, it's me," and he'd say, "Oh, I guessed you," or "I didn't guess you," or whatever. They'd chat, and then I'd be brought back in, and we'd all 3 chat together, and the next trial begins after another 45 seconds. Next time, I might be the caller, I might be calling Rick, and John might not be involved. The person who's not either the caller or the receiver gets a message saying, "You're neither the caller nor the receiver, but please try and guess who the caller is anyway." And if I was that person, it'd say, "Press 1 for John, press 2 for Rick." So anyway, this is an experiment. It's giving highly significant positive results. And it gave a result which I didn't expect, which has turned out to be extraordinarily interesting. And I'm spending tomorrow at Noetic Sciences discussing this and other new tests with Dean Radin, who's my closest colleague in this field of research. And the results so far, we've had almost 800 tests so far in Britain, very few in the US because it's only just been launched. These are done unsupervised, so it's possible that people would cheat, and the skeptics say, "Oh, well, obviously they're cheating." But there are internal reasons for thinking that they're not, and I could explain them if I went into the details more. But the unexpected result is this. The person who's not either the caller or the receiver is asked to guess who the caller is. And I was thinking that they might get it right like 51% of the time. I was expecting a weak positive effect. The guessing correctly is running at the moment about 56%. It's not a huge effect, but these are unselected people. Some of them are not very good at it. If we select people who are more telepathic or intuitive, we get higher hit rates. Anyway, with all comers, it's 56%. It's highly significant with the hundreds of trials we've had. But instead of getting the guess by the person not involved of who the caller is, instead of that being at 50, 51, 52%, it's at 45%. It's significantly below chance. I hadn't expected that. And I was really surprised by it. And I did the statistical analysis a couple of days ago. And yes, it's significant. And the effect hasn't gone away. I first noticed it when we'd only had 200 or 300 trials. It's persisted. In fact, it's got bigger, this effect, a little bit bigger. Now, why is that happening? Well, when I thought about it, I realized I hadn't really thought about the experiment properly to start with. When this test is happening, say Rick is thinking about John, and I'm trying to guess who the caller is. What Rick's doing is thinking just about John. What John's doing is trying to think if it's me or it's Rick. So his mind is reaching out to me and reaching out to Rick to see which one of us is the caller. Now, Rick's mind isn't reaching out to me at all. It's entirely focused on John. But John's mind is reaching out to me. I'm trying to guess who the caller is. The only mental impulse that comes to me is from John, not from Rick. And I then identify John as the caller when he's actually the receiver, making this negative score. So it's actually positive evidence for the negative score is like positive evidence for a phenomenon that I hadn't anticipated. And the interesting thing about this is that anyone a skeptic who wanted to sabotage it by cheating, it's almost inconceivable that hundreds of people doing this test would all cheat in this particular way. Since I designed this test and I've thought more about this than anyone else, even I hadn't thought that this would happen. And I designed the test. So it's extremely interesting that this effect has occurred. And what I'm planning to do next, in the next iteration of this trial, and I'm going to ask Dean if he thinks this is a good idea, if he can think of an even better one, is to redesign the trial. I asked Tom Steadall to, I've already discussed with him, it's a relatively minor tweak, where the trial would be as before. Rick would think about John, but instead of me being asked to guess who the receiver is, because who the caller is, my mind, you see, is reaching out to John and to Rick. I'm sort of involved. I'm complicating it because my mind's reaching out to John, so he's getting impulses from me, which might reduce the hit rate. If instead of being asked to guess anything, I'm just played music, or if I'm asked to do a short questionnaire, which would keep my mind completely off both Rick and John, then John would be getting an undiluted signal from Rick. And instead of 50% hit rate, the hit rate might go up to 60% or more.
So you underestimated the sensitivity, the telepathic sensitivity, in a sense, of the three.
Yes.
In the original design.
Yes.
Yeah.
So if this prediction of changing the design so that if the scores on average go up, and then I could tweak it in different ways too. This is getting quite exciting, you see, because we can start not just looking at does telepathy exist, yes or no, but looking at how you can make it more effective. So that's one trial. Now, the other test I'm doing, this is done by someone else, not Tom, but another of my developers, is something called the joint attention test. And this is something which, before I started investigating it, I think no one had ever investigated. It's known in developmental psychology that by the age of about 1, young children develop something called joint attention. And joint attention is when two or more people focus on the same thing, and they're aware that the other person's focusing on the same thing. So they have the same object of attention and know that the other does. Now, normally, human children, by the age of about 1, develop joint attention, and parents encourage it. That's why you see parents with toddlers, and they go along, and the toddler says, "Doggy," and the parent says, "Yes, doggy," and they read books, and they say, "Bunny rabbit." And what's going on is the development of joint attention. children who don't do that often turn out to be autistic. So it's part of our consciousness, which literally means knowing together, consciousness, to have joint attention. And it's well known in developmental psychology. It also occurs in animals. It's known that if monkeys see there's a banana in the cage, if they know that a dominant monkey can see the banana and can see them, they won't try and take the banana. But if they think the other monkey is looking the other way and can't see them, they rush out, grab it, and eat it. So it's actually an important thing in animal interactions. So there's been a documentation of joint attention in various animal species too. Now, the question I'm asking is a new one, and it's this. If when we're paying attention to something at the same time as somebody else, and our minds are linked to the same thing, there could be a kind of resonance between our minds, a joint resonance, because we're attending to the same thing, and therefore at the same time, and we're also know about the other person. So it could be a kind of resonant connection. There could be an implicit resonance going on. So the first experiments I did on joint attention were with people looking at the same object in the same place. I did these in workshops. And people worked in pairs, and we work at a corner. Say, for example, one of these pillars, and there'd be a joint object, say that recording device. I'd be standing right behind the pillar here, where I could see it. Someone else would be standing here. We wouldn't see each other, but we could both see the same object. And in these extremely simple and free tests, how we did it with 20 trials, one person, the looker, had an instruction sheet. In trial 1, it's random. Trial 1, look. Trial 2, maybe look. Trial 3, don't look, etc. So a set of instructions. So you have trial 1, and you have a click or a beep saying trial 1 begins. And the other person looks at the object. They have to guess if the other person's looking at the same object or not, say looking or not looking. In those tests, it turned out about 55%, significantly above chance. Wasn't terribly big effect, but it was consistent. And I now set up, some years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, I set up a preliminary internet experiment, and I've just launched a new state-of-the-art one on joint attention. How this test works is you log on to my website, you go to the joint attention test. You're doing it with a partner, one other person. You both log on through the internet. You're synchronized. And then it explains it. And then it says trial 1 begins now. And in trial 1, there's a pair of photographs of completely different scenes. And with each photo, there's music, a sample of music. Each photo has its own sample of music. And at random, in trial 1, either both of you see picture A and here the music goes with picture A, or both of you see picture B and the music goes with picture B, or one of you sees picture A and the other sees picture B, different music with each picture. After 20 seconds, you're asked to guess, was your partner looking at the same picture? Yes, no. And in this, the first time I did the experiment, the first version of the experiment, both people had to guess. It was a symmetrical test, so I got twice as much data, lots of data for the price of one. And it came out with a highly significant positive result. It wasn't a big effect. It was like 53 or 54%, compared with 50% by chance. But I had something like 5,000 trials, so it was highly significant. But then I thought, well, how can I make this not very impressive effect? It's there, something's happening, but the effect is a small effect. How can I make it bigger? And then I thought, well, maybe people are being confused because they're at the same time trying to concentrate on the picture and at the same time trying to guess if the other person's looking at it. So it could divide their attention. So I've now modified the test, the new version. There are 12 trials. One person looks at it 6 times and doesn't guess, and the other person guesses, and they're not asked to transmit it to the other, they're just asked to guess, and the other one's just asked to look. And then for the next 6 trials, you switch roles. And so there's 12 trials, they last about 10 seconds each, and with the bits in between, where you're making the guesses, the whole trial takes about 4 or 5 minutes. So it's fun to do, the pictures are interesting, the music's interesting, it's fun to participate in. And the score's now gone up from 53% to about 57% by, I'm getting half as much data per test, but it's better data. So I'm now thinking of ways of making this even more effective, and that again is something I'm going to be discussing with Dean tomorrow when we go through the data. And let me finally tell you about a new project I just launched in England about a month or two ago, 3 months ago. We've only done a few preliminary experiments. We've only got data points from about 1,000 subjects. And this is looking at joint attention on the big scale. Something's happening in the modern world which never happened in the past, which is that through the media, like television, you can have millions of people watching the same thing at the same time, like a football match or like the royal wedding or something. In that case, there are a billion people watching the same thing at the same time. Now, if minds which are engaged in the same activity have a kind of resonance with each other, can you pick it up? Does it feel different if you're looking at something that's live on TV that millions of other people are watching at this exact moment, compared with something that's a recording of exactly the same technical quality on the screen, but is not being watched by anyone else at this particular moment? Can you feel the difference? And so I've now a young Cambridge PhD in psychology, Dr. Guy Hayward, is now working with me on this one. And we've designed it in a very, very simple way. In the preliminary experiments, we have 2 netbooks, which only cost a few $100s, identical netbooks. We've got a series of TV programs. We have to look at the schedules, because whatever the time of day, you have to go with what's happening. And then we have the recorded versions, and we have those downloaded from the internet. The qualities, the technical qualities are as similar as we can get them. We haven't been able to find any difference in technical quality between the on-air and the recorded ones. And we've found that doing this in schools is a good way of doing it. And we have the two things there, and we then give people little voting slips. They put their sex and their age, you know, boy or girl and age in the school, and then we ask